name is Rob Powell. For the past few years, I've held the position of Deputy Team Leader at the Brecon Mountain Rescue Team here in Wales. The BMRT is an essential emergency service for rural Wales, staffed entirely by volunteers and funded entirely by donations from the National Lottery and members of the public. Our work is not just restricted to mountain or wilderness search and rescue for climbers and hill walkers. Our skills are also deployed by the Welsh police to search for vulnerable or missing persons, on assignments where we can employ our specialist medical and rescue techniques. I've seen some pretty wild things during my time in the rescue team, some of which have been more distressing or disturbing than I'd care to admit. But there's only been one incident in my entire career that myself or my colleagues have not been able to fully explain. This is the story of that incident. Mountain rescue teams can only be called on the authority of the police. A call is normally initiated by the local force in response to a 999 call or the report of a missing person. The team can be, and is, called out at any time of day or night, under any conditions, even on New Year's Day and Christmas Day. The relevant police personnel will initially alert the rescue team by means of a pager message. A little outdated, I know, but it reflects the slimmer-than-slim budget we're forced to work with year in and year out. Once the volunteers receive their "I'll respond" message, the ball gets rolling. A team leader or deputy team leader will then discuss the details of the incident with the coordinating police officers and decide on appropriate rendezvous points and if any additional assets need to be deployed. This can include additional teams, tracker dogs, or even helicopter support if the situation calls for one to be deployed. So I'm sitting in the Drover's Arms pub with a few mates, having just finished watching one of their younger brothers represent their high school in a rugby sevens match. Their team won, so spirits are high. We just finished some dinner. I'm about to get stuck into my first pint of the evening when my beeper goes off. I won't lie, I was a bit annoyed. I'd really been looking forward to that pint and were explicitly told to expect things like that. Such is the life of a mountain rescue volunteer. Anyways, I let the lads know that I had to leave, put my coat on, and began the 10-minute walk up to a small set of offices that serve as the BMRT headquarters. It's early on a Sunday night. Most calls seem to happen around holidays and weekends, and the place is empty. So I unlock the doors, turn on all the lights, and walk down to my office to phone the police liaisons officer to get all the necessary details. As I'm talking to the officer in question, my phone starts lighting up with text messages from various other team members, telling me they're on their way. Everything was coming together nicely, and the situation seemed like the usual basic search and rescue job. A couple of hikers went up into the hills on Saturday, intending to camp overnight before heading back down on Sunday afternoon. According to the person who called it in, the hikers hadn't returned on schedule, nor were they answering any of their phones, so they called us. Now, on more than one occasion, we've gotten calls from members of the public reporting missing people who weren't actually missing at all. Sometimes groups are slowed down by a dodgy ankle or an upset tummy and just so happen to be out of range of the nearest phone. I get why someone might panic, and it's always better to be safe than sorry. That's why the BMRT exists in the first place. So it always helps when the person making the call knows a little bit about the missing group's intended route, so we can retrace or follow it and potentially find them nice and quickly. If we can focus our search, we don't need helicopter support, which saves us a huge amount of money. I know that sounds callous, but we really do live and die on our funding, so it's essential we keep the purse strings tight. So I'm going through all of the core details with the liaison officer, determining the last group's route most likely started in Merthyr Tydfil and advanced north in the direction of Brecon town center. A pretty common route for hill hikers. We go through all the usual stuff, just like normal, then move on to the miscellaneous details that can often aid a search. These can include any medical conditions that might bring the missing persons into difficulty, age ranges, and things of that nature. You'd be amazed at how tiny, seemingly insignificant details can help with a search, so it's extremely important we compile as much information as possible, as quickly as possible. Only when I pressed the liaison's officer for more information regarding the emergency call itself, she became awfully cagey. Very little in the way of detailed information could be passed along regarding the missing group, the only significant detail being that the woman who'd reported them missing was absolutely distraught when she did so. The dispatcher had noted that no matter what she said or did, she couldn't seem to reassure the caller that their loved ones would be found. The caller seemed convinced that the group of hikers was gone and never coming back. Honestly, it's stuff like this that kept me in the BMRT for so long. Being the hero that people so desperately need at what for many is the lowest point of their lives thus far. Less than an hour after the initial beeper messages, myself and 4 additional volunteers had converged on the BRMT HQ, ready to begin our search. Our route would take us over 16 miles of hills and mountains, roughly 5 hours of solid walking, but it was likely we'd find the missing group of hikers in a fraction of that time. At least, that's what we told ourselves initially. We did find something relatively quickly, after only 45 minutes worth of hiking up gently sloping trails, but it didn't fill us with confidence. In fact, it did the very opposite. We found a tent, an empty, abandoned tent. Being a BRMT volunteer sometimes means you're basically a detective. You use small pieces of a puzzle to build up a larger picture of an overall situation. What we had before us was an empty 2-man tent, but we were looking for a total of 4 missing hikers. What was clear was that whoever had set this tent up had been easily able to make it down into Brecon to report an emergency. Only they hadn't. They'd apparently gone back up the trail, but why they do such a thing escaped us completely. But what was obvious is that they'd done so without their hiking boots. This was the first really worrying sign. This happened to be in the middle of March, not the coldest month on the year, but one which brings strong winds to central Wales. Wind chill can lower ambient temperature by almost half and tend to be the cause of most cases of hypothermia we encounter. A hiker can look outside, see a sunny day, and assume fine weather, but once they're up a mountain, the wind can drop the temperature into single digits and turn a seemingly benign situation into a deadly one. But it wasn't just the hiking boots that had been left being either. A fair amount of cold weather clothing had been left behind in the tent, along with what appeared to be a significant amount of food and water. It was at that point that any hope of getting through this rescue without having to call in helicopter support went right out of the window. Whoever was lost out there needed help, and quickly. So we called it in, and within minutes, a search and rescue helicopter had taken off from Neville Hall Hospital in Abergavenny with the intention of flying the length of our proposed route. Our eye in the sky was on its way. It was full dark, no stars by the time we made the call, and shortly afterward we began to see red and white flashing lights moving westward in the sky ahead of us. The helicopter's pilot and I exchanged greetings as they tuned into our radio frequency, and I kept in touch with them as best as possible as we advanced along our route. What's more, it didn't take long before the co-pilot spotted something unusual just about a mile or so ahead of us. According to the helicopter's crew, they had spotted a person running along one of the mountain trails in the opposite direction we were heading. They had tracked the individual's movements for a minute or two before losing sight of them around a set of standing stones. There are over 30 standing stones in the Beacons National Park. Some of them are many centuries old and wreathed in myth. It isn't known exactly how many of the surviving standing stones are prehistoric. Some appear to be memorial stones, and others may well have had more than one function, either as boundary markers, waymarks on ancient trails, signposts, or even rubbing stones for livestock. But whatever their purpose was intended to be, we had our next rendezvous point, one that we would have to reach quickly if we hoped to find our missing persons in good health. It took about 45 minutes of hard hill climbing before we reached the standing stones. After a minute or two of combing the area with only our personal torches for light, one of my team members called me over to one of the standing stones. Behind it, set into a little hillock that obscured it from view, was a small opening in the earth. I say small. It was just about big enough for a fully grown adult to climb inside, and what was clear was that it would be the perfect place for someone stuck on a mountain to take shelter from the biting wind and rain. I stuck my torch inside the opening and peered inside, only then seeing just how deep the passageway seemed to go. Wales used to be a hub for the British coal mining industry, and the country is now littered with disused mining pits and shafts, both ancient and modern. Knowing this full well, the underground passage didn't strike me as too unusual at first, and I actually thought that the missing hikers lucky that they might have come across something like this to shelter themselves. I called out down the opening, checking to see if anyone had slipped down the tunnel and gotten themselves stuck whilst trying to take shelter, but received no reply. I then called over one of the other team members who happened to be carrying the majority of our climbing ropes. We harnessed him up, staked climbing pegs into the earth just outside the entrance, and began to lower him into the opening to check for signs of life. We lowered him down so far into the earth that I began to worry about the prospect of him getting stuck himself, but thankfully, we didn't have to lower him any further before he had found something. He called out for us to pull him up, alerting us that he had found an item of clothing that possibly belonged to one of our missing hikers. So we did just that. We pulled him back up, took the item of clothing from him, and lowered him back down to continue looking. As he did so, I took a quick look at the jumper he'd brought up, and was struck by something unusual about it. It looked old, really old. Clothing exposed to the elements for long periods can end up looking pretty rough, but not that rough. It appeared as if it had been stuck down that hole in the earth for a long, long time. We didn't find anything else down that hole, or on the rest of the mountain. We stayed up there until about 3 in the morning, long after our helicopter support had to withdraw due to dwindling fuel, but we didn't find a single thing. No more clothes, no signs of life, and no bodies. The more it became clear that we weren't going to find anything, the more I thought about how the distressed caller seemed convinced that the hikers were gone. She had no way of knowing that whatsoever, yet somehow she was right. And that really didn't sit well with me at all. Throughout the next week, 2 more search parties took to the hills in hopes of finding a trace of our missing hikers. Both came back empty-handed. I expected reports of the missing hikers to appear in local news publications, only they didn't. When I tried to find out why, I was turned away by most police sources until one let slip that a judge at the High Court of England and Wales had placed a publication ban on the incident, meaning an order prohibiting publication under Section 11 of the Contempt of Court Act of 1981 was in effect, keeping all news of the incident out of the newspapers. But that's not what really bothers me about this whole thing. I mean, it's been confounding, sure, but it's another peculiar detail surrounding the case that keeps me up at night. The name stitched into the jumper we found down that hole in the earth was Robert Williams. I came to find out that this didn't match any of the names we'd been given regarding our missing hikers. In fact, Robert Williams had been missing from the nearby town of Neath since March of 2002, 17 years before our missing hikers were reported. Who was it that our helicopter support had spotted before they disappeared among the standing stones? Was it one of our missing hikers? Or was it in fact the long-lost Robert? Regardless, I can't help but think I'd find the answers to these questions at the bottom of that tunnel, hidden among the standing stones. Sunrise on Saturday, September the 23rd, 1972. An experienced climber by the name of Neil Olson is leading an ascent of a difficult section of the 24th pitch of the nose route of El Capitan. Sometimes known as El Cap, El Capitan is a vertical rock formation in Yosemite National Park, located on the north side of Yosemite Valley near its western end. The granite monolith is about 3,000 feet from base to summit along its tallest face, and is a popular objective for rock climbers. The aforementioned nose route is one of the original technical climbing routes up El Capitan. Once considered impossible to climb, El Capitan is now the standard for big wall climbing. Just as the group passed Camp 5, a set of ledges about 900 feet below the top of the cliff, a horrifically unfortunate accident occurs. Somehow Olsen pulls a 125-pound boulder loose from a wedging just above him, and he watches in terror as the huge rock begins to fall in his direction. His life flashes before his eyes as he tries to dodge it, but the heavy stone structure glances off his plastic helmet, still hard enough to stun him. The boulder then falls back and over him before smashing into his right leg and breaking it in several places. Olsen is rendered completely immobile and in agonizing pain, terrified that he might bleed to death as a result of numerous compound fractures to his leg. By 7:30, that very same morning, Yosemite Search and Rescue Officer Pete Thompson was helping to organize one of the most terrifyingly demanding rescue attempts in the history of North American mountaineering. Pete had assembled an A-team of 6 local climbers in his office, their mission being to develop an initial rescue plan, estimate equipment needs, and identify other technical climbers they'd wish to take with them. The idea was to lower one of the rescue teams from the summit, over 900 feet down to the severely wounded Neil Olsen, who would no doubt be overjoyed to see them. Then Olsen and his rescuer would then be lowered to waiting medical staff on the valley floor, almost 2,000 feet below. At the time, only one other long-lowering rescue even remotely similar to this one had ever been performed, in Grand Teton National Park in August of 1967, just over 5 years previously. In total, 18 brave, selfless men and 1 woman would be flown to the top of El Cap that day. The team's task was made even harder as a result of a disastrous incident earlier that summer, one that almost crippled their ability to mount any serious rescue attempt. Just 7 weeks before, shortly after midnight on the 1st of August 1972, a drunken 17-year-old reprobate had set fire to the thousands of tons of stacked hay in the California state government's horse barn. The barn and stables were set alight and burned to the ground, as were another 7 older wooden structures in the area in what was described as a manic episode of serial arson. One of these highly flammable civilian construction Corps-era buildings happened to be holding the valley's search and rescue equipment cache. Hundreds of climbing ropes, webbing, pitons, bolts, carabiners, sleeping bags, rain gear, and other such vital equipment all went up in smoke. Thompson knew that they were short on the right sorts of equipment to pull off a rescue of this size and complexity. To this day, a now long-retired Pete Thompson is not exactly sure how the park ended up with some of what it got that day. The most interesting were the large rolls of 1/2-inch rope. Tubbs Cordage, a yachting and sailing line manufacturing company in the San Diego area, had generously sent 2 4,000-foot-long rolls and 3 1,200-foot-long rolls of gold line, each tightly wound around a wooden spindle. Although plenty strong, the rope was not intended to take the kind of abuse it would be subjected to, and its use proved an almost fatal mistake to those who would later use it in an attempt to save lives. The ropes were driven up by local police departments to nearby El Toro Marine Air Station. They were then flown to El Capitan Meadow in 2 large, twin-rotor CH-46 helicopters, sometimes called Chinooks by civilians. Other retail outdoor companies in the Bay Area, such as the Ski Hut in the North Face, sent actual solid climbing rope, as well as a seemingly endless supply of colored nylon webbing, hundreds of carabiners, over 100 bolts, dozens of pitons, piton hammers, water bottles, dried food, and other long accessory lines and cords. These purchases were all picked up by the Bay Area Mountain Rescue Unit and transported by the California Highway Patrol. Before they returned to their home base at El Toro that evening, a team from the local Marine Corps base flew even more vital equipment and manpower to the staging point at the summit of El Capitan. There was a pile of equipment on the peak that night that had to be sorted and then placed in the right spot for the next morning. Rescuers worked tirelessly through the night to sift and sort through the mess of gear, determining which would prove the most useful in their rescue attempt. During the height of the stretcher lowering later in the day, several hundred people stood along the road and in the meadow at the base of El Cap, most with their binoculars pointed toward the light brown cliff, morbidly observing the ensuing rescue attempt. 6 of the Camp 4 search and rescue site climbers rappelled down to Camp 5 that first afternoon. Up top, the climbers knotted together enough ropes to create 2 3,000-foot lengths of cordage. One rope made a directional change at the victim's tiny ledge far below. The other ran straight from the final lip of El Capitan to Olson's litter, attended by Camp 4 superstar Jim Bridwell. Although it took more than 36 hours to fully orchestrate, once underway, the rescue attempt took just 90 minutes for the pair to be lowered down the remaining 1,800 feet of sheer cliff face. Luckily, the entire thing went off without so much as a hitch. The 5 still on the ledge, as well as Olson's partner, elected to come down later that night after dark when energy and focus had been recuperated. Al Garza, the park's chief electrician, built a huge light bank and illuminated almost the entire face of the Great Cliff. Just one small example of the gargantuan amount of work and effort that went into rescuing Neil Olson. Neil's leg healed, and despite the consequential injuries incurred from the accident, he continued to climb for the next 4 decades. But he never, ever forgot the horrors of what he had to endure on El Capitan that day. Nor did he forget the brave and valiant efforts of those who risked their own lives to ensure his own survival. Gene Hambleton was born on November 16, 1918, in Rossville, Illinois. Inspired by stories of combat flyers during World War I, his childhood dream was to serve as a pilot in America's armed forces. But by the time he qualified as a combat pilot at the U.S. Army Air Force's training wing, World War II was almost over, and Hambleton did not see any significant combat action. After the German and Japanese surrenders of 1945, Hambleton was released from active service. However, he retained an active reserve commission, which meant that as the 1950s rolled around and America commenced a brand new series of combat actions against communist insurgencies, Hambleton was recalled to active service, this time by the U.S. Air Force. During his service in the Korean War, Hambleton flew a total of 43 sorties as navigator in a B-29 Superfortress. Then, during the 1960s, Hambleton worked on various USAF ballistic missile projects such as the PGM-19 Jupiter, Titan-1 ICBM, and Titan-2 ICBM, a vital part of the USA's nuclear deterrent as it moved into the age of atomic warfare. After his involvement in the missile projects, he commanded the 571st Strategic Missile Squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona from 1965 to 1971. He also served as the Deputy Chief of Operations for his squadron's parent unit, the Strategic Air Command's 390th Strategic Missile Wing at Davis-Monthan, AFB, Arizona. After the commencement of the Vietnam conflict, Hambleton switched from the Strategic Air Command to the Tactical Air Command and was assigned to the 42nd Tactical Electronic Warfare Squadron in Koret, Thailand, as a navigator. The 42nd Tactical Electronic Warfare Squadron was equipped with the EB-66CD destroyer aircraft that flew radar and communications, jamming missions to disrupt enemy defenses and early warning capabilities. Not the kind of role that Hambleton had envisaged for himself as a youth, but it was a vital strategic contribution nonetheless. During his 63rd mission on April 2, 1972, Hambleton was a navigator aboard an EB-66C gathering signals intelligence, including identifying enemy anti-aircraft radar installations to enable effective jamming. The aircraft was helping escort a cell of 3 B-52 bombers tasked with attacking entrance passes to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vital logistical route that supplied the Vietnamese communist guerrillas with all of their weapons, ammunition, and equipment they needed to continue their struggle. The B-52s would use their huge payloads of highly explosive 2,000-pound bombs to obliterate the terrain and deny its use to the enemy. However, while flying at about 30,000 feet over Quang Tri, just south of the demilitarized zone that separated South Vietnam from its northern counterpart, the aircraft's emergency alarms began to wail. This meant only one thing. The aircraft was firmly in the sights of an enemy anti-air weapons station, which was preparing to lock and fire with a heat-seeking explosive projectile. The aircraft's pilot began evasive maneuvers, even going so far as to fire off its own electronic countermeasures, which were in the form of heat-radiating flares designed to distract and confuse an enemy missile into diverting from its intended target. The aircraft occupants felt the plane lurch and twist in the air, trying its hardest to avoid the missile strike, but to no avail. In one horrifying moment, an explosion rocked the airframe as a Soviet-built SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile slammed into the plane. The initial explosion killed a handful of the crew instantly as red-hot shrapnel ripped through the aircraft's interior, puncturing flesh and severing arteries. Hambleton was the only member of the 6-man crew who found himself able to eject as the aircraft began plummeting into the jungle below. But this was the least of his problems. Hambleton had found himself right in the middle of the North Vietnamese Easter Offensive and landed in the midst of tens of thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers. What followed was the largest, longest, and most complex search and rescue operation during the entire Vietnam War. Upon safely landing his parachute, Hambleton found himself concealed by a low fog bank as he landed in a dry rice paddy, unseen by the NVA troops. From his hiding place, he was astonished at the huge number of North Vietnamese Army troops, equipment, and heavy weapons in the area, with a handful of NVA infantry platoons bivouacked just 100 meters away. By a stroke of luck, Hambleton's URC-64 rescue radio had not been damaged during the missile strike or his descent, and his colleagues back in Thailand were able to pinpoint his location to just 2 kilometers north of the Cam Lo Bridge, which happened to be heavily defended by U.S. Marines. These coordinates were then quickly passed along to an HC-130 search and rescue aircraft operating just south of Quang Tri. Recovering Hambleton quickly was essential, as the odds of recovering downed airmen dropped below 20% if the aircrew member was on the ground after 4 hours. But their efforts would be severely hampered by the huge number of troops and large quantity of anti-aircraft fire in the area, some of it supporting the NVA's efforts to capture and protect the Cam Lo Bridge near Hambleton's position. What's more, at about the same time that Hambleton was shot down, commandos blew up the key bridge over the Q Viet River east of Hambleton's position. The NVA were subsequently forced to reroute thousands of troops, dozens of tanks, and other equipment west, immediately in front of Hambleton's position. Their valiant attempt to slow the NVA advance had put Hambleton in a seriously dangerous position. But perhaps what U.S. military intelligence found most terrifying about the prospect of Hambleton's capture was his intelligence value as a POW. Hambleton had more than 20 years of military service under his belt, and due to the majority of that being in signals and intelligence, Hambleton was one of the most knowledgeable missile and electronic countermeasures experts in the entire Vietnamese area of operations. 1972 was right at the end of the Vietnam War, and as a result, very few Americans remained on the ground. The NVA made it a point to attract particularly valuable personnel, even in surrounding foreign countries such as Thailand. The North Vietnamese were also probably supported by the Russian KGB, who by decrypting American message traffic likely knew exactly who had parachuted into their midst. This ability was most definitely enhanced by the then unknown American spy, John Anthony Walker, who had given the Soviets a radio cipher card and other high-value intelligence. Hambleton's capture would be a terrific blow to American air power around the world and a huge prize for the North Vietnamese and indirectly the Soviets. But Hambleton was hardly unprepared for such a disaster. He had received water survival training at Turkey Run, Florida, in addition to escape and evasion training and survival basics at the Pacific Air Command Jungle Survival School in the Philippines. Despite the shrapnel wounds from his aircraft exploding, a ripped finger, and 4 compressed vertebrae from the force of the ejection, Hambleton decided that with only 9 months to go until his retirement, he was going to survive and return home. But before he could do that, Hambleton had to relay the coordinates of the North Vietnamese around him. This must have satisfied any desire for revenge rather well, as Hamilton watched in secret as bombs and missiles began to rain down around him, all over the positions of the North Vietnamese. But such munitions are hardly 100% accurate, and there's no doubt that as Hamilton watched the ordnance explode all around him, he prayed that none would stray from their target and land directly on his hiding place. Time and time again, attempts to locate and rescue Gene Hamilton resulted in yet more casualties and destroyed aircraft. 5 aircraft have been shot down and another 16 seriously damaged, while an additional 10 service members have been killed or captured in their attempts to rescue their comrade. On the 8th of April, General Creighton Abrams, who would go on to have a tank named after him, ordered that no further combat search and rescue would be attempted, but that given Hamilton's top-secret clearance and knowledge of missiles and countermeasure technology, that every effort should be made to bring him home alive. And so, a covert land-based rescue operation was suggested instead. In Saigon, Navy SEAL Lieutenant Thomas R. Norris, one of just 3 SEAL officers and 9 enlisted men remaining in Vietnam, was waiting for orders when the call came in for a commando operation to get Hamilton out. Norris was immediately dispatched to lead an operation to rescue Hamilton. Meanwhile, the U.S. rescuers knew that the North Vietnamese were monitoring radio communications and understood English. However, Hamilton's rescuers learned that he was one of the best golfers in the entire United States Air Force and that he retained a detailed memory of the golf courses he had played. Improvising a code using a series of specific golf course holes to guide him through the minefield sown to protect him, they radioed him. "You're going to play 18 holes, and you're going to get in the Swanee and make like Esther Williams and Charlie the Tuna. The round starts on number 1 at Tucson National." Hamilton was initially confused and actually asked the radio operator, "What have you been smoking?" But he soon broke the code, realizing that they were feeding him information on the distance and direction they wanted him to travel. Number 1 at Tucson National is 408 yards running southeast. The reference to Charlie the Tuna was an allusion to the watercourse he'd encounter if he followed the direction correctly. However, to save time and speed up his rescue, Hamilton chose to pass through the abandoned village that concealed the guns that shot down some of his would-be rescuers. The village had been heavily bombed as retaliation, and the likelihood that there were any surviving North Vietnamese soldiers in the area were slim to none. But to Hamilton's absolute horror, he advanced into the smoking ruins of the village to discover that it had been reoccupied by NVA soldiers. Hamilton crawled through mud, brush, and smoldering wreckage, staying out of sight of the enemy's soldiers for as long as possible. But soon his luck ran out. He tried lying face down in the mud, mimicking a dead body in the hopes that a nearby patrolling sentry would mistake him for a dead NVA soldier. But it was not to be. The soldier began prodding Hamilton with his bayonet, his suspicions raised by the unusual uniform worn by that particular corpse. Hamilton winced in pain, unable to ignore the agonizing stabs, and the NVA soldier turned to scream warnings to his comrades. Yet Hamilton was quick. He leapt up from his hiding place, taking out the Air Force survival knife that was standard issue to all combat pilots at the time. As the soldier took a gasp of breath into his lungs, intending to release it as a terrified warning scream, Hamilton jabbed the sharp end of his knife into the man's throat from behind, sawing and cutting until the soldier's screams were drowned out by the blood that flowed through his windpipe. As the body lay at his feet and his veins coursed with adrenaline, Hamilton had no time to rest or recoup. He would have to go on, or suffer the same fate as that poor dead soldier, dead by his own hand. By the 11th of April, 9 days after he was first shot down, Gene Hamilton was too weak to move on any further. The rescue team on the ground, which had been reduced by constant NVA harassment from a dozen individuals to just 2, knew they would have to act fast. The remaining rescuers, an American Navy SEAL and a Vietnamese commando, commandeered a traditional Vietnamese river fishing boat known as a sampan, intending to be discreet, a mobile method of reaching the downed pilot. But before they departed, each confessed to each other that they may not survive such a desperate, daring attempt. Disguised as Vietnamese civilians, they rode quietly upriver, but even in the pitch-dark and dense fog, they could see large numbers of North Vietnamese soldiers and tanks on the shoreline. Stopping to check his map at one point, the sole U.S. Navy SEAL suddenly realized that 2 NVA soldiers were sitting about 10 meters away. However, they were asleep. Traveling upriver in the sampan, they broke out of the heavy fog and found themselves about 4 kilometers from their starting point under the Kamlo Bridge. They had passed Hambleton's position more than 30 minutes ago. Turning around, they worked their way south before putting ashore and began to search for Hambleton. They finally found him sitting in a clump of bushes, alive but partly delirious and extremely weakened, having eaten only 4 small ears of corn in 12 days and having lost 45 pounds since his plane was shot down. Sunrise was coming, and although the SEAL thought it best to wait until dark to return downriver, Hambleton needed to be evacuated immediately. Despite the risk, the SEAL and his Viet counterpart hid Hambleton in the bottom of the sampan, covered him with bamboo, and started downriver. Landing on a riverbank back in friendly territory, they were met by some South Vietnamese soldiers who assisted in getting the wounded Hambleton to safety. There, an M113 armored personnel carrier carried Hambleton and his rescuers back to brigade headquarters in Dong Ha. He was shortly afterward evacuated to the hospital at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, where he recuperated for a month. The rescue of Gene Hambleton was a watershed event for the military and led them to find a new approach to high-threat search and rescue. They recognized that if a search and rescue mission was predestined to fail, it should not be attempted, and other options such as special operations, divisionary tactics, and other creative approaches tailored to the situation had to be considered. Recognizing the need for an aircraft that could deliver better close air support, the Air Force accepted the Navy's A-7 Corsair. The military also improved the night capability of helicopters and area denial munitions. During the Vietnam War, search and rescue forces saved 3,883 lives at the cost of 71 rescuers and 45 aircraft. May their contribution never be forgotten. I'm Colm Michaels, and I live here in Coquitlam, a city of the lower mainland of British Columbia, Canada. I work for the Coquitlam Search and Rescue, a volunteer search and rescue association based here in BC. Our primary area of operations is just shy of 2,000 square kilometers and includes some of the most rugged and inaccessible terrain in the southwest region of the province of British Columbia. The team also provides assistance to residents during natural disasters such as floods and earthquakes. But my work isn't at the glamorous end of the spectrum, loading up into helicopters and winching wounded walkers off of mountain trails. I'm more at home in my office cubicle than I am in the belly of a rescue chopper, and much more comfortable in jeans and a polo than a climbing harness and safety helmet. You see, for the past few years, myself and a handful of other IT graduates have been working on a publicly accessible database that compiles information of British Columbia's missing persons. We built a database with dozens of names compiled from the memoirs of SAR volunteers throughout the province. So far it dates back to 2002, when many files started going electronic. Delving further into the past will be difficult, with paper records gathering dust on the desks of other volunteer members, but it's something we find extremely fulfilling. Every missing person's profile we complete is a little ray of hope for a family that would do anything to gain a little closure, and each one is a personal victory for my small but dedicated team. Having said that, there was one case in particular that I'd like to discuss today, one that left me increasingly disturbed the more I studied it. This is the story of Mackie Basil's disappearance. Immaculate Mackie Basil was born on December 8, 1985. The 8th of December is also the date of the Roman Catholic feast of the Immaculate Conception, which is how Mackie's parents decided on her name. Although we've been unable to find out why, Mackie's parents, Samuel Basil and Patricia Joseph, abandoned her to British Columbia's foster care system when she was young, along with her sisters Ida and Crystal. She was known to be an introvert who rarely partied and was not known to drink or do drugs. She was also very selective with who she spent time with and often preferred to stay at home cleaning, decorating, completing tasks, being online, talking with her sisters, or spending time with her son, Jameson, who was just 5 years old at the time of her disappearance. The testimonies of those close to her, referencing Mackie's preference to quiet nights in as opposed to drunken nights out, leads us to our first major conundrum. Because on the night she was last seen, Mackie was apparently attending a house party on the Tachi Reserve, an enclave of the Tlasden tribe of First Nations people, of which Mackie was a member. She was driven up to the reserve by a cousin of hers named Keith, which is again unusual given that Mackie was apparently averse to going anywhere without her own wheels, and if she did, it was often with her son in tow, along with some extra clothes, a makeup bag, and a bag of spare diapers for her young son. This, along with the fact that the house party was only 20 minutes' walk from her own home, led us to believe that Mackie had intended to walk home, and for whatever reason, had made the decision to drink alcohol that night. It was also June 13th of 2013 at the time of the house party, and summers in British Columbia can be much more temperate than people imagine, therefore ruling out the possibility that Mackie was caught in bad weather. The next thing that we know for certain is that the police then named Mackie's cousin and his friend Victor as suspects in the disappearance. Both were arrested and subjected to polygraph tests to determine if there were any inconsistencies in their story. At the time, given that they were the last two people to see Mackie alive, it was assumed to be given that they were responsible for any foul play that may have occurred. But the Royal Canadian Mounted Police reported to the Basil family that both men were cooperative, and that even interviews with forensic psychologists have gone very well, essentially eliminating Keith and Victor as suspects. However, what became evident during these interviews is that Victor and Keith didn't just give Mackie a ride to the house party at the Tachi Reserve, they actually gave her a ride back too. Somehow, Mackie had gotten out of the car during a ride home that should have taken 4 to 5 minutes, maybe even less. During interviews, Victor and Keith had claimed that their truck became stuck in a patch of mud, but it was high summer at the time and recent weather had been fair. Obviously, this answer did not satisfy police investigators, hence why they were subjected to numerous interviews and lie detection tests. But afterwards, they were happy enough to release the men from custody. Our team had reached out to Victor and Keith in order to ask them to shed a little more light on the events of that evening. Both aggressively declined. We may never know the reason that Mackie got out of her cousin's truck that evening, but we're certain she did. Forensic examination of the truck she was present in found absolutely no traces of blood or anything else which may lead us to believe that they had killed her. What's clear is that Mackie was now alone, in the middle of the night, on a lonely woodland road in the middle of British Columbia. If the RCMP had effectively ruled out foul play as the reason she disappeared, this leaves us with two serious theories: accident or animal attack. Although there are numerous dangerous wild animals that are known to live in that area, the theory of an animal attack is brought into question due to the lack of evidence of an attack found by the searchers involved in the thorough ground and air search. There was no confirmed recovery of any of the items that the young mother had when she went missing, nor was there any discovery of blood or other remains confirmed to be hers. If she went missing due to an accident or misadventure, then it is also reasonable to presume that she would have walked to where she had met her demise. That would have been well within the range of the search party who were looking for her remains, which were never found. For all intents and purposes, a young woman went to a house party one night and then dropped off the face of the earth. Missing people always leave something of a trail behind, one that 99% of the time leads us to locate them to be dead or alive. But somehow, Mackie did not. It really is as if though she just melted into the ether. It should also be noted that Mackie's cousin, Bonnie Marie Joseph, went missing on the exact same stretch of road just 6 years previously in September of 2007. This stretch of road happens to be known as the Highway of Tears, a 725-kilometer corridor of Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert, British Columbia, which has been the location of many murders and disappearances beginning in 1970. What sets Mackey's disappearance apart is that most of those murders and disappearances have been solved relatively easily, while Mackey's case shows absolutely no sign of being solved anytime soon. I used to be a cop. When I say that, most people picture some highway patrolman with a pair of aviator sunglasses and a salt and pepper mustache. But that wasn't me, not by a long shot. Sure, I spent a little time on the beat. Every new cop has to chew a little gum before they can advance, but advance I did, right onto the police helicopter's pilot's course, and eventually into the Drug Enforcement Agency's aviation division. Based out of Fort Wallace Alliance Airport down in Texas, the DEA's Office of Aviation Operation is home to only the most elite of police pilots. There are only about 120 of us at any one time, manning and maintaining only about 100 airplanes, helicopters, and recently, more and more unmanned aerial vehicles, or as civilians call them, drones. I flew 53 missions for the DEA, most of them during the mid to late 80s and early 90s during the DEA's Colombian campaign. But there is only one of those missions that I think about every single day, one that will haunt me right up until the day I die. I suppose the whole thing started with Tranquilandia. Literally translated from the Spanish as Quiet Village, Tranquilandia is a small rural village located about 160 miles south from the town of San Jose del Guaviare. The village came to our attention when a U.S. diplomatic attaché had innocently asked for a study on Colombian chemical imports. What they discovered led us to the sleepy little jungle village, where we discovered not just a cocaine lab, but a veritable cocaine factory. The factory is fully equipped with living quarters for more than 100 people, several storage rooms for chemicals and supplies, and workshops for automobiles and airplanes. With this efficient production line, traffickers were synthesizing 20 tons of cocaine a month, putting $12 million in the coffers of the Medellin cartel in only 2 years. Authorities seized more than 10 tons of cocaine and cocaine based on Tranquilandia and found more labs and similar compounds in the surrounding jungle. The police destroyed drugs and material conservatively estimated to be worth $1.2 billion, but this discovery was only the beginning. We had uncovered an entire network of cocaine production and smuggling, one that would take many months to completely dismantle. It's during this operation phase that I flew the mission that changed my life forever. One night, I was woken up by a member of our team who informed me that an emergency mission was being planned down in the briefing room. The team leader had handpicked me as the lead pilot, given that I had somewhat of a speciality for flying in low-light conditions. But I had to drag myself to the briefing room to get any actual info. It was to be a search and rescue operation, probably the most high-pressure, high-risk mission a helicopter pilot can ever be assigned to. And high risk it was. A small group of Colombian Junglas Special Force soldiers, advised by an attachment of U.S.-born DEA agents, had been ambushed and routed by a group of cartel or cartel-aligned gunmen. One was already KIA, but another was on the run with his emergency location beacon pinging every few seconds. We were tasked with the unenviable job of tracking the beacon to the agent's location, then getting him out of Dodge. I immediately set about preparing my chopper for takeoff. Myself and my co-pilot checked our fuel gauges, tested for metal fatigue as best we could, and studied maps that charted the emergency beacon's course. Missions like that normally meant an accompaniment of Colombian law enforcement or special forces guys, but when we were just about ready to depart, a group of guys who I'd never seen before rolled up to the helipad and introduced themselves. I use the term introduce themselves very loosely because they didn't, not really. They were our special forces guys, Americans, and they didn't use regular names or call signs, and they didn't even really look like soldiers either. All had thick facial hair, no markings on their uniforms, and they even carried a few unconventional sidearms that suited the jungle environment. They looked more like the bad guys we were fighting than anything else. We lifted off the helipad in almost complete darkness once the Special Forces team had piled into the belly of the beast, flying southwest for about an hour or two until a silver of pale blue daylight had started to creep onto the distant horizon. Suddenly, the SF team's radio chatter went into overdrive, and their team leader demanded I land in a nearby clearing. Obviously, I obliged, bringing the chopper down among long grass as the Special Forces soldiers piled out of the chopper and sprinted towards the tree line. Only then did I see what they were talking about. It was a body, slumped against a tree, with one arm weakly waving in our direction in the dim morning light. Even from like 100 meters away, I could see that their face, arms, and uniform were caked in dry blood. What little skin was exposed was so pale it was almost ghostly. I watched transfixed as the SF guys reached the tree line and began to drag the wounded agent onto their shoulders. But suddenly they dropped the guy. So hard I snapped at them over the radio to be more freaking careful. They couldn't hear me, but that didn't matter. But once again it appeared that they'd seen something that I hadn't, because all of a sudden they began hurtling back towards the waiting chopper, a look of terror on their faces. Just as I was about to ask them what was going on, I was blinded by a bright flash in the middle of the clearing. By the time I could see again, the Special Forces guys were back to the chopper, screaming at us to take off and get out of there. When I looked up, I saw the right side of the chopper's windshield was covered in blood and gore. I was confused, but none of us had time to think, as right at that very moment a light show of muzzle flashes erupted in the tree line around us. The chopper rattled and shook as gunfire ripped through the airframe. The crack and whiz of bullets could be heard even over the roar of its engines. I turned to my co-pilot for a second and saw he had a hand clamped tightly around his throat. Blood squirted out from between his fingers as he struggled for breath. I turned to the SF guys in the back to ask if any could give my co-pilot first aid, but they were occupied with their own casualty. One of their team's legs was missing above the knee, and the remaining 3 were fighting to properly tie a tourniquet as the chopper lurched forward after takeoff. There was nothing I could do but try my hardest to get us back to base safely, and I'm not quite sure how I did it, only that I somehow did. Just not in time to save the lives of my co-pilots and the Special Forces soldier wounded in what turned out to be a cartel ambush. As it turns out, the cartel-aligned gunmen had shot and killed both of our DEA agents in the initial ambush on the Colombian patrol. Then, they'd packed one of the bodies with remotely detonated explosives, activated the emergency beacon, then simply waited for us to show up. As for the waving motion the body seemed to be making, I asked one of the SF guys what the deal was a few days later. He told me the cartel had strung up the guy's arm with wire, then tugged on it slowly as he flew overhead, making it look like the guy was alive. That's the thing I can't get ever out of my mind. The sight of that dead man, waving up at us, inviting us to join him. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, always date a gamer.